Great. Okay. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today's morning, afternoon, evening for some. We really appreciate your attendance with us today for this really important and complex discussion about corporate accountability in global food systems. I'm Penny Milsom. I'm a public health doctor and a researcher with a current focus on commercial determinants of human and planetary health. And I was a recent postdoctoral fellow at the UNU IIGH, where I contributed to the Institute's work on power and accountability in global health. We're really grateful, and I will be moderating the session today. We're really grateful to have an excellent panel with us today, including Mark Winger, who's the Research Director of Access to Nutrition Initiative, so ATNI. We've got Meg Jones-Monteiro, who's the Senior Director for Health Equity at the Interfaith Centre on Corporate Accountability, where she is responsible for corporate responsibility, where she's responsible for ICCR's shareholder engagement and advocacy on global and domestic health issues. We have Phil Baker, and Meg is joining us incredibly early for her time, so we're very grateful for that. And we've got Phil Baker, who's joining from Sydney, so very late for him. Phil is an associate professor and an Australian Research Council Future Fellow at the School of Public Health at the University of Sydney. And his research, he's had a long time focus on ultra-processed foods and human diets, the governance and political economy of food system transitions, and the commercial determinants of infant and young child nutrition. We're also very lucky to have Ana Maria Suarez Franco, who is joining us from over here in Europe. So not a bad time difference for her, but we're really grateful to have her. She is the Secretary General of VIAN International, an international civil society organization that works to promote the right of food and nutrition. And last but certainly not least, we have Busiso Moyo, who is a South African activist and scholar affiliated with the Institute for Social Development and the Centre of Excellence for Food Security at the University of Western Cape. He's also the National Coordinator of the Union Against Hunger, South Africa. So we're thrilled to have you all join us and bring your expertise and perspectives on this critical issue of corporate accountability in food systems. And we will be posting the full bios of each panelist as we go. So just a few housekeeping things before we proceed. This webinar is being recorded and available for public viewing. And please do introduce yourself in the chat now as throughout the webinar, and particularly if you'd like to pose a question, just so we know who we're responding to. That'll be fantastic. I'll be doing a brief introduction of the work that we do at IIGH and also the findings of our analysis of the Access to Nutrition Index Global Index to start to, I guess, create a starting point or a catalyst for the discussion today on strengthening corporate accountability for sustainable food system transitions. And then we'll be hearing a presentation from each of the panelists. We'll then allow a little bit of time for panelists to respond to each other and open then the floor for questions from the audience, as well as comments as well. Obviously, we want to make this as interactive as possible at that stage. So I will start to proceed with my presentation now. And again, thank you very much for all joining us. Thanks, Sylvia. So if we could go on to the next slide, Sylvia, that'd be great. Thanks so much. So the United Nations University Institute for International Institute for Global Health, my apologies, is based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and it is the designated UN Global Think Tank for Global Health. And it serves as essentially a policy transition hub for UN member states, agencies and programs, and engages broadly with a wide range of interest holders, including academia, civil society, and NGOs. It serves as one of the UN system of 13 international think tanks that are located in 12 different countries globally. Next slide, please. The UNU IIGH's current strategic plan aims to address the inequalities in global health with a particular focus on the globe of addressing inequalities in the global south. We have 4 work packages, one being gender inequality and intersectionality, power and accountability, digital health governance, and climate justice. And power and accountability we present is the work package that we'll be presenting on, or we're focused on today. We have a range of different tactics and lenses. And then obviously our mission is to build knowledge and capacity for decision-making by UN agencies, UN programs, and member states about global health issues. Next slide, please. So why focus on power and accountability in global health? We know that, and particularly I'm focusing this discussion on food systems, which is one area of work that the power and accountability team focuses on. So we know that dominant corporatized food systems are not currently meeting the nutritional needs of the global population, and are contributing to climate change, environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, social and economic inequalities, and obviously driving a rising burden of NCDs. Transnational food corporations have wide influence and increasing influence over people's diets in most countries, and Phil will possibly be talking to this later on, including through the mass production and marketing of cheap ultra-processed foods. Obviously, their diets in each country are quite different, very different in low income or the global south compared to the global north. But certainly, we've seen ultra-processed food producing companies continuing to try to infiltrate markets in the global south. We've seen accumulation and concentration of transnational food corporate power, economic and political power to shape food systems in their own interest, particularly through processes related to neoliberal globalization and neo-colonial processes as well, and multi-stakeholderism, which we might also hear other speakers talk about. And these processes pose really a major barrier to sustainable food system transitions. Next slide, please. So there's been an increasing call for transnational food corporations to improve their policies and practices towards expanding the healthiness and affordability and ecological sustainability of the foods they produce. But we've seen a tendency to rely on essentially voluntary mechanisms, things like scorecards and indexes, and obviously we'll be talking about one of the indexes that monitors corporate behavior or food corporate behavior today. And this has tended to be as opposed to the use of legal instruments and government regulations. The Access to Nutrition Initiative's Global Index is one such index that ranks 30 of the biggest food corporations towards improving, in terms of their efforts towards improving access to affordable and nutritious food globally. And these indexes and scorecards have gained significant legitimacy within global health governance spaces. But to our knowledge, the ATNI's Global Index, for example, had not been critically analysed, independently critically analysed, and we felt this was an important thing to do, considering its influence in global food governance. So we undertook this critical analysis of the ATNI's Global Index, assessing their governance, management methodology, and the validity of their underlying theory of change to drive socially responsible corporate policies and practices. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, I'm going to try and rush through this, and I'm sure that Mark will present more on this. So ATNI's Global Index has 51 indicators across 8 different categories: governance, product healthiness, improving product healthiness, use of nutrient profiles, affordable nutrition strategies, responsible marketing, workforce nutrition, and responsible labeling. Next slide, please. So back one slide. Thanks. ATNI's theory of change has developed over the years, and in 2023 they updated their theory of change. Indexes is one part of it, but they've also have multiple other elements to the theory of change, including working with investors, and we'll hear from Meg about that. And also they're increasingly working with governments to promote regulatory change to increase the access of healthy foods in countries. And Mark, obviously, I'm not going to speak in a lot of detail about this because Mark will speak to the theory of change of ATNI's theory of change. But we were primarily focused on the global index in our analysis, although did obviously take into consideration their other elements of their strategy. Next slide, please. So we found in our analysis, we looked at looked in detail at each of the indicators and also the way that they scored companies in relation to each of those indicators. And broadly, we found there was a tendency to rely on assessing companies' policies and targets as opposed to their performance or impacts. And we recognize that obviously assessing impacts on diets is challenging. And ADNI is a small organization, so many of the criticism that we identified do have to do with limited resources of a small organization. We also noted, however, use of a narrow nutricentric definition of healthier products. This is something that I think Phil will potentially talk about, as opposed to taking a more holistic approach and taking into consideration the other properties of ultra-processed foods that are increasingly being identified as having negative health impacts. And we know that nutrient profiles that corporations tend to be happier about that because they allow reformulation without having to actually product reformulation without having to challenge their underlying business model of making a huge amount of profits off ultra-processed foods, which ultimately have other negative health impacts beyond their nutrient content themselves. And again, I'll leave that for Phil to expand on. Thirdly, we found there was really importantly a neglect of several important aspects of corporate behaviour, including within the index that was measured. So the global index doesn't measure corporations on their financial conduct, their corporate political activities, or their interference in the integrity of food science and research. All of these areas we know that food corporations do actively undertake unethical behaviours. And again, I know that that there is an element of this in terms of resourcing, that whether ADNI would be able to include all of these components in the index. And fourthly, there's a high reliance on data that's voluntarily submitted by companies because there is no regulation for companies to provide data transparency regulations, which makes it very difficult to be sure that the data they're providing is accurate. Next slide, please. And we also identified the obviously positive elements of the ADNI's global index and their broader strategy primarily. So we know that ADNI's increasingly focusing on promoting government regulation to promote change in corporate behaviour. As they've mentioned to us, they have noted they're aware that the index has a role, but they're also committed to promoting regulatory change and also increasing engagement with responsible investors to try and promote corporations to change their behaviour through pressure from investors. But I'll leave that to Meg to talk about, and others may also want to comment on that. It's difficult to know what the impact of that is, but there's certainly positive. We consider these to be potentially positive shifts in ADNI's focus, although I think they've been engaged with responsible investors for some time. Next slide, please. So our key recommendations for ADNI were to monitor and assess the biggest food companies with stronger standards across an expanded spectrum of corporate behaviours, including those I mentioned before, using a more pluralistic set of data sources, adopting a broader definition of healthier products that includes not just a focus on nutrient content, but also on level of food processing and use of packaging, and to continue to expand its work on the role of regulation and fiscal policy, improving access to healthy diets. Next slide, please. Finally, before I hand over, I just want to say we recognise that ultimately, while ADNI is making a contribution, ultimately strengthening corporate accountability to facilitate sustainable food system transitions must be the responsibility of a wider set of adequately resourced actors and interest holders, and involve a broader range of regulatory and fiscal and legal mechanisms. So it really needs to involve civil society and governments in the process, and it can't be the responsibility of small NGOs to do this work. We could have I feel like we've just scratched the surface in terms of our analysis, but I hope that we can dig slightly deeper in our discussions today. So thank you very much. I will now hand over to Mark to speak. Mark, as I mentioned, is the the research director of ATNI, and he's going to present to us in more detail on the work of ATNI. Thank you very much, Mark. Over to you.
Thank you, Penny. Let me start sharing my slides. I hope this worked. I think it's not in presenter mode yet. So let me try to change that. Here. Let's see if that also works out on screen. Yes. Thanks again, Penny, for introducing me and ATNI as well in some of your slides, so that will help me to skip some of these parts in my presentation. Let me start by introducing myself. I have a background in human nutrition and health from Wageningen University, graduated in 1992, and then worked for about 12 years for humanitarian NGOs and for the FAO in different African countries until 2004, when I joined UNICEF in the Netherlands and worked for UNICEF on child rights issues globally and in the Netherlands for about 14 years. So that was until 2018, and that's when I joined ATNI. And I state I have no conflict of interest, and also that my organization, ATNI, does not take any funding from industry. And we also ask all our staff members, board members, and expert advisors to sign a conflict of interest statement before they join our work. Oh, it's still, I see I'm still in presenter mode. It did work. I hope I don't have to do that for every slide now. So here you see a bit about ATNI's key metrics, if you want. We started off as an initiative or project developed by GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, in 2010-12, but especially to become and remain completely financially independent from industry, ATNI was established as a foundation in the Netherlands in 2013. I'm not going to read out everything on the slide, but just want to stress that you can see here some of our current donors, which include governments as well as institutional foundations. Penny already showed our very detailed theory of change. I just wanted to highlight that we do indeed exist for the sole purpose of transforming markets for nutrition. And we do that by, as we believe, actively challenging the food industry, investors, and policymakers to shape healthier food systems and deliver better nutrition outcomes. We're very much on board on the overall vision of the UNU and the Independent Expert Group as formulated in their statement of the urgency and importance of improvement in corporate accountability. And we're eager to do as much as possible to make sure our role in this effort has the maximum positive impact through research and indexes of companies that in our global index we estimate represent about a quarter to a third of the global packaged food sales. We also partner with investors, as you will hear a bit more from Meg about in a bit, to use their leverage on companies to do better. And as Penny also mentioned, we, over the last few years, also moved into the policy sphere, trying to make sure that our research and data are useful to inform policy processes and help civil society, UN agencies, and governments to formulate better and stricter regulation for healthier food environments. One example here is that of East Africa. But let me start by giving some initial feedback on the UNU and International Expert Group or Independent Expert Group statement reports. So we are in agreement with many of the points in these reports. And when it comes to, for instance, the topics we are not covering, we have actually considered taking on many of these suggested topics beyond nutrition that are not covered in our global index. But as Penny already said, as a small organization, we had to decide that we are just unable to do this. And we do see value in having several entities, other entities with different objectives and resources to take the primary responsibility for these issues. And we would like to cooperate, as I will explain later, to work with them. So we have since 2023 added this policy work stream to our work to inform processes towards stricter and more effective regulation and regulatory policies, fiscal measures, etc., starting in East Africa, which resulted in a regional policy workshop last year with representatives from governments, civil society, and academia from Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, 3 countries that have started developing food policies and are in need to know what baseline they are working with, what would be the most effective possible policies. We keep abreast of complementary efforts such as by the Informas network, which we are partnering with and trying to intensify our contributions with. On the investor and finance side, we have a set of activities, and Mac will explain or give some examples of how that works in practice, but activities that aim to influence investments more structurally, e.g., for example, at the national level with SEBI, by embedding nutrition within their Business Reporting Act, and at global level with ISSB as part of the SASB standards consultation, and for instance with S&P Global, which have started using some of our metrics as part of their corporate accountability assessment. So though we agree with the vision to improve corporate accountability, we do disagree with any suggestion that the impact of our global index or other tools and research would be to inhibit progress in the broader sphere of corporate accountability. ADNI tools and data, we believe, are essential to any effort to improve nutrition globally and at country level, because none of the other actors or organizations that we know of do provide specific data on companies in the way we do. And that's not to say that we feel that our data are the only truth and the only source of information to be used. No, far from that. We realize we are a very small piece of the puzzle, and a lot more is needed to contribute to better corporate accountability. So I'm glad I get the chance also to say that our global index is where we started with, but we do a lot more, and over the years have developed indexes and thematic reports on different geographies and themes, and you see some examples here. We, for instance, also monitor performance of baby food manufacturers in terms of in how far they comply with the WHO code on breast milk substitutes, and as the audience will not be surprised of, we found that none of the global companies and also no local companies actually fully comply with this code, both in terms of marketing, responsible marketing, but also not looking at the nutritional quality of these products. We also engaged in some indexes looking at suppliers of ingredients like oil or premixes for fortification with vitamins and minerals, and have since 2016 done country-specific indexes in the UK, India, and the US, and where we tailored our methodology to local contexts in consultation with local experts. After 2022, when we did a first attempt to look at supermarkets or retailers in the UK, we last year started a retail assessment of the largest retailers in different income settings, 6 countries, and we published an East Africa market assessment focusing on Kenya and Tanzania. But going back to our global index, the subject of the UNU report, we believe it has contributed to corporate attention for and interest in nutrition, initial reporting by companies against external standards, but it has not transformed the market or led to healthier portfolios. That's something which we clearly see after 13 years of monitoring. We started in 2016 monitoring portfolio healthiness with an independent performance indicator using nutrient profiling models and applying these to label data of packaged products. And consistently have found only a quarter to a third of the products that manufacturers, but also retailers, bring to the market could be considered healthy using one of these models, Health Star Rating, and using a threshold of 3.5 stars out of 5. So less than a third or less than 25% of products do pass that threshold. And as I said, most recently we found that the same goes for the private label or own brand products produced and distributed by large retailers. And you see an example here from the US, a study which we published end of last year, looking at Walmart, Kroger, and Food Lion, 3 of the largest retailers in the US, which was one of the 6 markets we included in that assessment. And looking at the figure here on the right, you see that whether we use a nutrient approach, just looking at levels of fat, salt, and sugar, the HFSS model, or also includes the presence of markers of ultra-processed foods, something which we have started doing. And these markers would be colorants, flavors, or non-nutritive sweeteners. We see that the majority of the products the retailers produce themselves and distribute themselves, their own brands. So 75 to 88% of products are unhealthy. So a clear sign that not only manufacturers but also retailers have a lot to do to improve their portfolios. One example from our global index to show that it's not just about creating an overall ranking, but we really feel that we are providing a lot of in-depth data on specific companies and countries. And this slide shows how our global index now also allows for zooming into specific countries and seeing how multinational companies produce and often sell less healthy products in low and middle income markets compared to what they sell globally. Our efforts to strengthen global index and the many other indexes and research projects we undertake with more objective data and inputs are ongoing, like the assessments of packaged foods on the markets in Kenya and Tanzania. On the slide you see the results for and numbers for Tanzania in terms of relative healthiness of portfolios of both multinational and local companies. Although in some cases, as you can see, the number of products assessed was relatively small. Overall, only 25% of the products by the aggregated industry, packaged food industry in Tanzania, is not healthy. So similar to what we found at the global level, showing the need for more action needed to improve food environments for a start, but also to prevent things from getting worse. I'll end with a conclusion to say that we feel that since 2022 we have somehow corrected the issue, as pointed out by the UNU report, that some companies ending on the top of our ranking do abuse that ranking for blue washing or whitewashing or whatever we want to call it. But of course, there's a large group of companies which are not in the top 3, which do have a lot of improvements and do, as we know, take note of the results and internally discuss them. But we have corrected that sometimes too positive framing of the incremental steps that companies have taken, and now place much more emphasis on the core message, which has been the main result of all our indexes, that companies are not performing well overall. And the other important, I think, notion is that high rankings or scores do not mean good performance. So the top scorer in an index might be the first ranker in a class of laggards. We are very much open to suggestions to making our tools stronger. And based on the statement by the independent expert group, offer two ideas for consideration in the next phase. So one is that given the complexity of the issues of access to healthy foods and nutrients and the number of global actors involved in these efforts, we would really like to contribute to develop a strategy of how we can go beyond patterning from separate silos to a dynamic, perhaps AI-assisted approach of combining key points at company level to tell a more complete story of their social responsibility and accountability. And secondly, and lastly, we believe a collaboration on developing a theory of change, as I think the expert group statement starts with, but linking that to concrete steps or roadmaps to improve corporate accountability can be needed. So a focus on the indirect pathways whereby failing on food and nutrition issues can be positioned to motivate more progress. And consistent with that framework, we very much agree that no single tool, so also not our indexes or research, can be effective in impacting health outcomes. So we really feel that much more concerted efforts are needed. And in terms of impact, we are experimenting with modeling exercises to see how changes in product healthiness could in the end be linked to health outcomes, which, as the reports conclude, is so far not very clear or obvious. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that really insightful presentation. I guess I just wanted to say, Mark's been referring to the independent expert group. So in light of our analysis of the global index, but also an analysis of the access to medicines index, we convened an independent expert group, we being IIGH, and convened an independent expert group to produce a statement on providing recommendations on how to strengthen corporate accountability in global health, and that can be found. We can share the link to that in the chat as well. I guess I just wanted to reflect on one thing before we move on, Mark. A major concern of ours, obviously, with the assessment of companies across a narrow set of indicators and not including these broader areas, including their tax behaviors, their environmental practices and so on, or the impacts on the environment, that it may make companies appear more socially responsible than they in fact are. And that can help then sort of legitimize their undue influence in food system governance. So it'll be really interesting to hear from the other speakers, their perspectives on that. And we noticed, particularly in terms of, for example, the highest rankers in 2024, Danone and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, Danone and Friesland's Campina. They're ranked in first and second in 2024, but they don't comply fully with the WHO's International Code on Marketing breast milk substitutes. So they can still rank first in the index and second in the index without complying with the code, which I know that's taken into account when in terms of how you rank companies within the index, but that seems a dissonant to present a dissonance for me. So yeah, perhaps we can talk about that a little bit later. And then I guess finally, the incremental improvements, and you presented obviously that we haven't seen significant improvements. So I guess another potential criticism is that does this focus on incremental improvements shift away from a focus on more deep structural economic transformation that some would argue is really essential for creating healthy and sustainable food system transitions, and we'll hear from others on that as well. And it'd be really interesting to undertake that same assessment you did in terms of comparing companies, the healthiness of their product profiles using the nutrient profile, but actually, assessing them in terms of how they using the NOVA classification, so ultra processed food classification, or a variation of it in terms of seeing, how healthy is their product profile and how has it changed over time? Has that shifted at all? Thank you very much. Sorry, I took up too much time there. Next, we'll hear from Meg Jones-Monteiro from the ICCR. Thanks, Meg. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Penny. Appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel. Just want to really clearly state up front, I do not have any conflict of interest. And I will be sharing slides. So give me a second so I can pull it up. Great. So really quickly, my name is Meg Jones-Monteiro. I'm the Senior Director for Health Equity at ICCR. ICCR is the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. I'm going to quickly just kind of go through who we are and what we do, and how that sort of relates to this presentation today. So we are a broad coalition of over 300 plus institutional investors. We're based in the US, but we are global in nature. We represent over $4 trillion in assets under management. So that's reflective not of us as an organization, but of our members. We are a cross-section of institutional investors. So this includes faith-based investors, asset managers, pension funds, foundations, and other socially responsible investment firms. So not necessarily the top 5 large asset managers that you may all be familiar with. Our members are active, not passive owners, and because of the fact that they're active, they within their portfolios will engage hundreds of companies each year, and it's on a variety of different topics, which I'm going to address in a minute. We have been around for over 50 years, and I know that many people refer to sort of managing ESG risk, but the concept of ESG is a rather new concept compared to where ICCR started. Our grounding really is, and all of the work that we do is through the lens of human rights. Sorry. So our theory of change is that because we work predominantly with investors, is that we have members, we try to mobilize the fact that they have ownership in companies, but we do this through collective action. So, power in numbers, we mobilize our members to engage companies on where we think and they think practices and policies need to change, and how that actually positively impacts the environment and human health. Obviously, the greater goal here is that we have greater equity and justice for people in the long term, sustainability for the planet. So it is a sort of very aspirational. What we focus most on within these engagement firms is shareholder engagement. And just to kind of differentiate, you have people at these investment firms that focus on making investment decisions, right? And that would be in which companies to invest. That's not something that ICCR really focuses on. We focus on with the stewardship teams. The stewardship teams are those who actually engage directly with executive management and boards on a variety of different topics. But I thought it would be helpful to just kind of go through the different types of tactics that we use as investors. But to start off with, some of the things that investment firms can do is they have positive and negative screens, right? So they identify based on their investment criteria which companies they will either invest in or divest from. There's proxy voting. Proxy voting actually includes voting on resolutions that may be on proxy, voting on directors, voting on executive compensation, et cetera. And then there's an impact investing arm of some of our members as well, which is not public equities, but it's investing. It's sort of a separate arm of investing. Within the shareholder engagement space, we can engage companies through dialogues, through investor letters, through proxy resolutions. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, through press campaigns, multi-stakeholder engagement. I will talk about that as well. And obviously public policy advocacy. I think one thing that's important to recognize, and I think Mark referenced this, is, a benchmark alone is not going to change corporate behavior when we recognize that we have to have various strategies in order to figure out how to, not necessarily, in some instances put pressure, but recognize there are other levers that we have to work on in order to, achieve corporate change. Our priority issues are pretty broad in scope, to be quite honest. There's not very many things that we don't focus on. We work on advancing worker justice, is really focused on sort of labor rights in the US and Canada, climate change and environmental justice, broadly corporate political responsibility, which includes political contributions and lobbying of companies, equitable supply chains, and then health equity. Within the health equity space, which is what I support, we really engage the food and beverage industry, retailers, casual restaurant chains. And then I also do a lot around pharmaceutical access to health technologies. And then more recently, it's actually around the use of technology and AI. We also have sort of a separate initiative focused specifically on investor change around human rights, and that's our Investor Alliance on Human Rights. I actually don't have them on this slide, though. Our work is grounded in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So broadly speaking, we have done a lot of engagement on working with companies around developing robust human rights policies, making sure that they have human rights due diligence processes in place, the use of human rights impact assessments, and then lastly, what companies are doing to remedy the harms that they've actually caused. Our approach is really that, again, we have to make sure that our engagement strategies integrate the perspective and voices of impacted people and communities. So in how we develop our strategies, it's understanding what people on the ground are experiencing in them and how we figure out how to translate that into an investor ask. Obviously, at the end of the day, our members, one of their main responsibilities is a fiduciary responsibilities to their clients, like for whom they're investing. Part of that fiduciary responsibility is recognizing that there are adverse impacts that companies can create on people and planet. And so there's a sort of a duality around the financial responsibility or the financial materiality and what we call or salience or double materiality. What are the social impacts? It is our perspective that we need to figure out how to hold companies accountable for their actions and how they are actually, transparently reporting to investors and stakeholders on the company impacts. Lastly, to kind of talk about our engagement principles, I'm not going to go through every one of the points on this slide, but our members focus very much on the long-term investment, long-term value proposition for investment in a company. They're not focused on short-term, not necessarily focused on, listening in on to quarterly calls and just monitoring whether stock price goes up and down. But these are members who have been engaging and have been invested in these companies for the long term. The other piece that's critically important is that stakeholder engagement is very important. We feel that it's critically important for the companies to actually be engaging with rights holders. So it's impact on communities, impact on shareholders, and then certainly directly impacted communities. The one thing that I think is always important to share is that oftentimes when we engage with groups, there is sometimes a perception that, investors have money means power. We have access to companies. Access in and of itself means that there's power to change corporate policy. We have limitations as to what it is that we actually can do. In the context of dialogues, we are relying on companies' willingness to engage with us in an authentic manner. We don't necessarily have control over that. We are tied to an off-calendar cycle. So when I talk later around resolution filing, for example, which is something that happens within the US market, there are very clear guidelines and guardrails around how we file a resolution, what our ask looks like. We are governed by the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, so we can't just put anything into a resolution. And so that's why, in the end, we would hope that there are things that we can do to sort of move the needle, but we are limited in some of the influence that we have. This is just a really quick visual representation of the types of companies that our members engage with. Again, they need to be able to hold these companies within their portfolio in order to be part of these engagements. And I think this is really what's critically important, and it kind of underscores some of the things that Mark said previously. our asks not only come from sort of the real lived experience from people on the ground, but we have to be able to supply some level of data and standards to inform what our company asks are. Some of those things that we use are sustainability reporting standards, which include SASB, GRI, and then obviously what's happening with CSRD and EFRAG in the EU. But to be honest, those are insufficient. Oftentimes, they're focusing predominantly only on financial materiality, and they aren't actually covering some of the data and information that we as investors want to see. Now, that suggests that we need to be engaging those standard setting bodies more actively, which we are. But we need to supplement that data with actually data that helps us figure out what some of the asks should be and how do we compare companies across. And so that's where the research reports and benchmarks comes in. So the use of the Access to Nutrition Index is helpful because it's data that we wouldn't otherwise have. In the ideal world, you would have government regulation, and these regulations and policies would force companies to disclose, and there would be a universal sort of set of policies or benchmarks or metrics upon which these companies would have to disclose, and that doesn't exist. There's variability from country to country. Obviously, there are no global standards necessarily that are enforceable, I should say. And so we rely on almost like a triangulation of data points that we have to pull from in order to formulate the asks that we have. So, you know, outside of the sustainability reporting standards, research reports, and benchmarks, we also use investigative journalism and media reports. And that's important to get in front of companies because unfortunately, sometimes what the negative news in the media will prompt companies to take action. And then there's always existing policies, regulations, and even pending regulations. So the context in which we engage companies is oftentimes around financial risk, regulatory risk, legal risk, and reputational risk, albeit reputational risk is a lot harder to quantify. But I think what I want to underscore here is that there is no one data point, benchmark, research report, media report that will necessarily propel, I think, a company to make some sort of meaningful change. It's a combination of all of these things. And when all of these things are aligned, oftentimes it makes for a better case. Just to really quickly say, while I focused on sort of the nutrition insecurity piece, which is sort of what the ATNI benchmark focuses on, our members have also focused on the broader food system, so deforestation, food waste, antimicrobial resistance, water impacts, protein diversification, and worker rights. So we have in the past, and it is hard, there is no benchmark that gets at all of these different issues. I would say for investors, it would be great if there was something that we could look at the broader impact of a company. But unfortunately, at this point, that just doesn't exist. I wanted to really quickly touch on what is a resolution. So a resolution is something, at least in the US market, that shareholders who own a certain amount of shares are able to file according to the filing deadlines and ask a company to essentially put on their proxy. Companies are able to file what are called no action letters, which means they will do what they can to get it off their proxy. And that is something that's actually overseen by the Securities and Exchange Commission, albeit that has changed this year. And so these are types of requests. And again, we are only limited to 500 words. So we have to be very careful about how we word these resolutions because there are things that will get it thrown out. But an example of something that has been filed the past 2 years is really requesting the board of directors to issue what's a third-party assessment to have PepsiCo assess and mitigate potential health harms associated with the use of non-sugar sweeteners. So this was something that was informed by our community partners, academic partners, as well as to what are the types of asks that we should be getting in front of companies at this time. So that one we filed twice, actually got pretty good support, given that it's a pretty niche issue for investors. This year, we filed one that's not that dissimilar, but it's focusing more on hazards to human health, looking at sort of chemicals and additives in food and beverage products. And we felt this was a compelling ask, given, at least in the US, and the sort of establishment of MAHA and commitment on the part of HHS. This was one piece where there could be some sort of regulatory movement forward. I'm not going to go into the appendix, but essentially I just have these slides, I guess, will be shared later, just examples of sort of the standards from GRI and SASB and EFRAG as well.
Thanks so much, Meg. Thanks very much, Meg. That's really, really insightful to get. I have here a presentation on what exactly you do as from the responsible investor side, I guess. And one thing that we've talked about before as well is we've got the responsible investors, but then, you know, how does your activities stack up against, you know, the large asset management companies, you know, BlackRock, Vanguard, how if they're not on board with what responsible investors are pushing for, what kind of, you know, how impactful is your actions? But we can perhaps bring that up, discuss that towards the end. But thanks so much, Meg, and we'll move on now to, I think we have Phil up next, and Phil's going to provide some reflections and additional reflections on the Global Index, as well as some suggestions for strengthening corporate accountability and bringing more of a structural approach to that. Thanks so much, Phil.
Thanks, Penny, and thank you to you and Dave and other organisers at UNU for this this great panel session. Thank you to the other speakers, and thank you to everyone who's joining us. I just want to start by saying the arguments that I'm making this today are by no means speaking against the good people who work at ATNI. This is a structural critique. We're focused on the system, and I really appreciate the talk that Mark just gave. And ATNI is doing great work in many areas in our food system for nutrition, and I just want to start by saying that. But I will offer a structural critique of ATNI as an example of a broader shift in global accountability and governance in our food system. So I'm gonna start with some history. Over the past century, the idea of corporate accountability has undergone a profound transformation. The regulation of transnational corporations by states using law, public policy, democratic oversight has increasingly shifted towards a world of voluntary commitments, partnerships, ESG investing, and scorecard approaches to accountability, like ATNI, for example. In my talk, I want to trace this evolution, explain why this shift in governance and accountability has ultimately failed, and I want to make the case for re-anchoring corporate accountability in public law and governance as the only credible path forward for a sustainable and healthy future for our food system. Now, historically, corporate accountability emerged from a very simple premise that corporations derive their legal existence and their market privileges from the state, and therefore they must be regulated in the public interest. When corporate and market actors cause harm, the role of the state is to intervene to regulate those harms, to ensure that that is discontinued. In the post-war period, governments used competition and labor laws, consumer protection, and public health and environmental standards to regulate corporate behavior. And at the international level, efforts were made, for example, the UN Centre on Transnational Corporations, and the proposals that were made in the 1970s for a binding code of conduct on transnational corporations to constrain the growing power of these corporations at that time. But from the 1980s onwards, as neoliberalism emerged and markets were liberalized, states retreated, and governments were encouraged to avoid direct regulation, and corporate power subsequently expanded dramatically. Now, into this vacuum stepped a new model of global governance and corporate accountability called stakeholder capitalism. So rather than binding rules, corporations were asked to make voluntary commitments. Rather than enforcement, states and UN agencies responded with partnerships. Rather than democratic governance and civil society is playing a watchdog role, the preference became reputational incentives on scorecards and league tables. Now, corporate social responsibility, ESG, investing and reporting and scorecards promised a world in which corporations would regulate themselves, guided by market signals, investor pressure, and what is sometimes called moral suasion. Now, scorecards and ESG metrics now sit at the center of this accountability ecosystem, and ATNI and ATME are important examples, although there are many others in global food and health governance. The Nutrition for Growth has a similar framework. The UN Food Systems Summit had one as well. The Global Nutrition Report. There are many, many examples of this type of approach to corporate accountability in our food system. Now, these rank companies on nutrition, the healthfulness of products, as Mark very clearly articulated, access to medicine, sustainability, social responsibility, and other aspects of corporate behavior, claiming to incentivize better corporate behavior. But the independent expert group convened by UNU shows that this approach rests on several deeply flawed assumptions. The first is that these are built on weak standards. They assess intentions, policies, and commitments rather than real-world impacts. Companies can score highly while continuing practices that harm health, undermine labor rights, degrade the environment, or distort public policy. Second, they systematically ignore harmful corporate conduct that matters most for public welfare, including tax avoidance, monopoly abuse, aggressive lobbying, litigation against governments, and the manipulation of science, as Penny mentioned earlier. Now, these behaviors are central to corporate power, yet they are largely invisible in scorecards and ESG frameworks. Third, scorecards rely heavily on self-reported, unverifiable data, privileging what can be easily measured over what truly matters. Qualitative evidence from affected communities, investigative journalism, and civil society groups is therefore marginalized. Now, as the IEG report makes clear, these mechanisms often legitimize rather than confront corporate power, often actively used by the corporations themselves to argue that stronger public laws are unnecessary. The recent Lancet series on ultra-processed foods helps us to understand why this governance and accountability model fails at a structural level. In the third paper of that Lancet series, shows that multi-stakeholder initiatives and public-private partnerships with transnational corporations pose major barriers to addressing sustainable food systems challenges. And there are three really crucial consequences. First, this approach to governance and accountability depoliticizes harm. Structural problems like ultra-processed foods, fossil fuel dependence, or pharmaceutical monopolies are reframed as technical challenges that are solvable through things like reformulation, more efficiency, better corporate behavior, or innovation, rather than through regulation. Second, they produce weaker policy outcomes. Voluntary commitments substitute for binding rules. Self-regulation replaces state enforcement. Solutions are selected and proposed by corporations through these partnerships precisely because they do not threaten profitability. Third, evidence consistently shows that ESG initiatives and voluntary actions do not meaningfully constrain harmful corporate behavior. When shareholder value is threatened, ESG commitments are abandoned, diluted, or even actively opposed by investors themselves. And this is something we say in the Lancet series. Danone's former CEO, Emmanuel Faber, is a good example of this, who lost his job when shareholders disagreed and ousted him for his progressive sustainability-focused vision. So what does real accountability look like? Well, the answer is actually pretty clear, and we make it clear in the IEG report and in the Lancet series. Accountability must be anchored in public policy, in law, in human rights, and in participatory governance. Governments must reclaim their regulatory role. Corporate behavior should be governed by binding and enforceable rules, not by voluntary pledges, covering things like taxation, competition, marketing, labor practices, environmental protection, and also, and crucially, political activity, getting these companies out of the policy-making room. Second, accountability must be grounded in a human rights framework, and Ana Maria will speak to this shortly. The rights to health, food, a healthy environment, impose legal obligations, and ongoing efforts towards a binding UN treaty on business and human rights is absolutely necessary. Thirdly, governance must be participatory and democratized. This means safeguarding policy spaces from corporate interference, establishing strong conflict of interest safeguards, and ensuring that civil society, workers, Indigenous peoples, affected communities have meaningful power in decision-making. Now, as the IEG report emphasizes, civil society-led mechanisms and forms of accountability, community monitoring, people's tribunals, litigation, public interest litigation are essential to countering concentrated corporate power. This is what accountability looks like. Now, finally, accountability must be understood as structural and not reputational. It is about changing the rules of the game, how markets operate, how value is distributed, and whose interests governance serves. So in closing, the turn towards multi-stakeholderism, scorecards, and ESG was not accidental. It emerged alongside the retreat of the state and the rise of corporate power. And decades on, the evidence is clear, this system of accountability is not working. Now, if we are serious about protecting health, equity, and the future of our planet, we must move beyond rankings and partnerships and return to what accountability was always meant to be: the rule of law, grounded in human rights and democratic governance, and enforced in the public interest. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Phil, for a very compelling presentation. I'm not going to respond because we're running out of time, but thank you so much. And let's move on to Ana Maria. Thanks so much, Ana Maria. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Penny, and in general to the center for this invitation. My name is Ana Maria Suarez Franco. I am the Secretary General of FIAN International, which is a human rights organization. We have sections that work directly with affected communities and advocating on policies in 19 countries, and work with other organizations in about 60 countries with a very emancipatory approach of human rights. And all what I will tell here is not only my production, of course, but I have to recognize that this is the outcome of the collective work and wisdom that we have been doing with the Right to Food and Food Sovereignty movement. And also especially the analysis that my colleagues Laura Michel and Sofia Monsalve did on the document of the UNU. So I would like to begin remembering a bit what the human rights approach means, and many elements will cross with what Phil said. The first thing is that we do not see right holders only as consumers or beneficiaries of policies or companies' decisions, but we see them as human rights holders with entitlements who have the possibility and the agency to change policies as well, and can claim the compliance with human rights states' obligations. The other side of the coin, then, is that states are duty bearers with obligations, and under all human rights and also under the right to food, the huge corpus juris that has been developed since the adoption of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights recognizes the obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill. And the obligation to protect is especially important regarding the harms or adverse impacts produced by food corporations. It includes the duty of states to regulate, monitor, investigate in case of alleged violations, and sanction if there are those violations. So it's not only, as Phil said, based on damaging reputation, but it's really taking action to enforce the law. And the obligation to fulfill also includes providing effective remedy to the affected communities. Remedy can go from changing policies until reparation or even measures to ensure not repetition. When we do human rights monitoring, we do not look only into structures, but we also look into processes, how these human rights are implemented, and these processes should be informed by the principles of participation, accountability, non-discrimination, transparency, which includes also the right to information, human dignity, and the rule of law, being human dignity the underlying principle and end, which means that people cannot be used for the aims of others, for example, for profit. Of course, there are entire literature on human dignity, but just to say that in a very simple way. And in the newest interpretations of human rights, of course, the care for nature is very relevant, especially since the recognition of the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment by the Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly. The political background connects with what has been already mentioned, giving priority to the most marginalized communities and the historically disadvantaged and unrepresented groups in society, and ensuring that they can participate in governance decisions and in other kinds of exercises that contribute to governance decisions, but also especially correcting power asymmetries. And lately, the recent demands of the human rights movement and the food sovereignty movement, based on this human rights perspective, argue that we need not only technical fixes to all the violations that food and agricultural corporations are causing, but we really need a shift of the food system, a transformation of the food system that is based on the right to food, and this vision based on an entire corpus juris of what the right to food is that, as I said, has evolved over 70 years. It connects also with the right to healthy environment, the right to labor, and other rights, since we consider the human right to food as a holistic right, and I will come back to that. Civil society has a vision of corporate accountability that is based on prevention, but also on liability, and I will also come back to that. Access to remedy for the affected communities and individuals along the value chains, which is oriented also by access to justice, to effective remedy, and including the extraterritorial jurisdictions. So we are speaking here not only about prevention, but also about what do the societies do, what do our governments do when the people suffer the impacts. And in this human rights approach, most of the actors nowadays reject the multi-stakeholder approach to governance based on the existing power asymmetries, because even if it looks as democratic, on the end, the power of these companies in the multi-stakeholder spaces is so big that normally the demands of the civil society remain really oppressed. The next point that I would like to clarify is, or to reaffirm, is that the right to food is a holistic right. So we consider that fragmented approaches like the mere nutritional approach is not enough to change the system and to avoid violation. It's necessary to look into all the aspects of the food system, including also economic, political, spiritual, and social cultural aspects and the interconnections between them. And therefore, we consider that any way to monitor the right to food should take into account these connections, as has been mentioned already. And of course, the elements that the right to food analyzes is adequacy of food, accessibility and availability, and sustainability, not only of the food that is on the table, but also of the resources and all the processes that bring this food to our tables. I would like to shortly say that it is very difficult to get all the needed changes in behavior of corporations that this human rights approach presents or obliges to states just through measures that are agreed with companies. Why? Because it's not that the people that work in the corporations are bad, it's that their legal mandate is to produce profit in the exercise of their activities. So any tool that we create to change their behavior that comes from other sources and is based on their goodwill will do soft changes. Some can change some realities, but this will not bring us to the deep structural changes that are required by public law regulations in order to really get more fair, sustainable, and healthy food systems. For example, these changes would imply that the sugar beverages companies should stop producing some of the stuff. So only with benchmarks and indicators, we will not get it. And that's why we need the authorities, the governments, to legislate for public goods. Then regarding human rights monitoring, we heard that the index is mainly based on the measures that the companies take. This is very connected to the concept of the due diligence that the UNGP, the UN Guiding Principles, introduced. We in the right to food accountability movements think that due diligence is not enough because it's based on what the companies consider that are the risks and the mitigations they can take, and we would like accountability that goes beyond that and that looks into the harm. So looking only into what we, the lawyers, call the conduct obligations, but not looking into the result obligation not to produce harm is not enough to really avoid the violations of the right to food. And in this sense, to see what is important to see the impact, as the study of the university says, and this impact can only be documented really going to speak to the small fruit producers, the consumers associations, and other movements that are active in the right to food and food sovereignty movement. I mentioned, and I will not go very deep into this, that we would like binding rules, and Phil already explained why the voluntary rules do not work, based on access to justice, civil, administrative, and criminal liability, and also recognizing the extraterritorial obligations, which means that the affected communities and individuals should be able to claim in the places where the companies have their controlling companies, mother companies, or the assets to provide the remedy. And we have been asking for some tools that are important, and we hope that initiatives like the index or any other indicators initiative do not displace from these more regulatory-oriented initiatives, like food councils at the local level, also laws on taxes, marketing, food environments, national rules on conflicts of interest and corporate accountability, and of course, what Phil mentioned, the legally binding instrument on TNCs and other businesses enterprises with regard to human rights, and the tax convention that we think is a very important tool to disconcentrate the power. Final remarks, we think that tools like the index can show some performance, but not the whole picture. And they should not replace in any way the accountability by the states or pave the way for greenwashing or further power concentration. And this is relevant. I would like to support the last remark of Phil, saying we need to go back to states really regulating the food sector to really get the more radical shift that we need with the participation of the affected and the rights holders. We think also that any initiative like this should not only disclose the conflicts of interest of those who write the study, but of those who provide the information, because otherwise it's very difficult for people to really interpret in a way that shows what is the reality. And as it has been said, the information comes from these actors, from the corporations that are monitored, so they are kind of judge and party in the play. And finally, we think that governmental and intergovernmental institutions have obligations that should not be outsourced. We cannot continue outsourcing government responsibility, but we have to demand that our governments comply with them. And this is the call for really go to the real accountability, not confusing that with the corporate social accountability that has been deeply criticized by social movements and human rights organizations. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Anna Maria. Yeah, that was amazing to hear a human rights perspective on corporate accountability, which I think is, obviously Phil mentioned it, but otherwise we were lacking a little bit in our discussion. I'm handing over to Buseso now. Buseso, in the interest of time, do you think you perhaps could keep to your 8 minutes, and we'll have a very few minutes at the end for some final comments. Buseso, over to you.
Right, greetings everyone. In the interest of time, please forgive me. I'm going to try and dash through my presentation this afternoon. My name is Busiso, and I'm coming all the way from Johannesburg. I'm an affiliate of the University of the Western Cape, but currently immersed in social movement building in South Africa. And I am at the forefront of the newly fledgling social movement that is known as the Union Against Hunger. So to get us going, yes, I have no, declarations to make, no strings attached. If anything, there's a snapshot of my own research interests, and I trust that everybody will then engage, with my presentation in the spirit of my own biases that I foreground in this conversation. So just to provide a snapshot of my own, kind of feedback on the index and how it is that I then find myself contributing to this discussion today, I think there's definitely value add that comes with this index, and it's something that is, we need to continually refine, try to crystallize and articulate. So I'm very much sympathetic, to what, institutions like the ATNI are trying to achieve, because in essence, how do we intervene in an environment where something is firmly within the grasp of the private sphere, but has its impact on the public good? So I think, I'm somewhat sympathetic to the frustrations that come with those conversations. But I think at face value, of course, for some of us who are based in the global South, there were some obvious blind spots in terms of the articulation of some of these, business and human rights kind of interfaces insofar as what we're talking about when we're speaking about a nourishing food system for all. So I think we need to be better in tune with the lived experience, right, of the right to food, building on what Anne-Marie has just said, to say, how do people put a claim, right, on their right to food? Because the biggest elephant in the room is that in as much as, all of this falls part of a much larger statecraft that speaks to land, agrarian reform, and other broader concerns, the truth of the matter is that government does not necessarily produce food. So we need to speak about, private private sector actors and, their commitment and their posture, to human rights and so forth. So the right to food in particular, I felt like was not central to the index. And I think a whole lot of work has gone into that space in particular. And it would be a worthwhile thing, perhaps for the point of departure, to try and then, dwell on some of these, on some of this great work that's also been done within, kind of like the human rights space and so forth. But I think as well, there's a lot of mistrust that defines the space. And I think what's important is that the struggle sometimes I find is the language, all right? Because when we are engaging corporate actors, we fail to speak, we fail to engage in that business speak that they're comfortable with, and that they're somewhat more comfortable to lend an ear to. So sometimes I think it's about us also thinking outside the box and trying to get the language right in a way that then attends to this mistrust that I'm reflecting on. And as well, just to also point out that I think as well for an institution, right, that is grappling with the multinational corporation footprint and its global reach, I think there are some major blind spots, because the point of departure should be such that, the food system, in as much as we want to talk about food systems transformations, and in as much as we want to to advance the fulfillment of the right to food, we must also acknowledge that the food system is not broken. All right, it functions exactly as it was intended to, right? Benefiting, the main core mainstream kind of, international order, and having these externalities to the rest of us who find ourselves at the periphery. So part of that is to speak about, the geopolitics or the imperial relations of food, in such a space. In so doing, then that affords us a space to then to then advance our own critique as those who are based in the global south, particularly and in a country like South Africa, right, where commercial realpolitik has won the day in the food system. So that is what I also wanted to point out as I go along. And just to give you a snapshot of what we are grappling with, right, in the global south, the most latest sort of evidence base that we have that speaks to the situational analysis in the country, gave us a snapshot of what's happening in some of our provinces in the country. And what we have here is the Eastern Cape province here in South Africa, where, it was reported that up to 67% of the population located therein was chronically food insecure. So where we are in South Africa and where we find ourselves, right, is that we are now advancing this rhetoric that kind of seeks to shift us from rhetoric more towards action, insofar as politicizing hunger as state failure. But part of that is about, what is the statecrafted play that somewhat continues, to lend an ear to a more neoliberal ideological posture that seems to be obsessed with econometric thinking and econometric considerations when it comes to the agenda setting that has to do with, food systems, nutrition outcomes, and food systems transformation more broadly. So how do we challenge the state's posture to this issue, such that we can challenge first and foremost the lack of leadership, the policy inertia, and then also such that the state can then have a demand from the populace that then enables it to then confront, these super predatory capitalist, actors who are very much entrenched in the food system. So the Union Against Hunger has come on board to further reflect and try to, maneuver within this very difficult and very complex space that we find ourselves in. And just to provide a snapshot of what we are currently going through in South Africa, it's that ours is a context of the highest inequality in the world. So in a context where we have joblessness, landlessness, how are people then interacting and interfacing with their food system? And ultimately, this is a story of incomes, right? Because that is the sure way that people then have that, claim on their right to food. But what we are seeing is that there's a food affordability gap in South Africa, and once again, again, it's about this constitutional fidelity, particularly in light of our own, human rights heritage, to then speak to the fact of what is the role of business and human rights in this conversation, linking back as well, to this idea that gave prominence to the Ruggie principles and so forth, that Anne-Marie so much touched on, that, corporate actors are also stakeholders within society, and how is it that they're carrying this burden with this. So to just show you where we are in the sort of interface that we're faced with, nothing much has happened in South Africa beyond policy rhetoric and the willingness, I guess, that somewhat hints at the fact that we have some kind of credible political will to really advance, food systems transformation. But in terms of the nitty-gritties of that issue, the best we have, a low-hanging fruit, has been the health promotion levy that we were able to advance. A struggle that started in 2013 and ultimately, we were able to achieve success in 2017 when the health promotion levy was adopted. Obviously, we started off by making calls for 20%. Ultimately, that ended at 10%. That was adopted. It was recently adjusted for inflation, so we're working with 11%. But somehow we seem somewhat stuck because of this corporate pushback. Now, power is discursive. When we are in these platforms for policy and public consultations, engaging government and policy practitioners, corporate actors are nowhere in the room. And part of that then becomes, how is it that somehow when the state concludes on matters, it always seems to favor, corporate actors. And part of that is that, we need to then speak to how we, as those people who find ourselves in the fringe, whether we're academics, civil society actors, activists like myself, to then say, how do we then deal with this discursive power of corporates? Because ultimately what we are now facing in South Africa is a corporate or is private sector players who don't even have to contest anything in terms of articulating their pushback, but we just see it in their actions, and they've got major financial backing and so forth. So what we are currently trying to do as civil society is to make all of these issues palatable to the populace, right? Because ultimately what we're up against is super predatory capitalism that is backed with very much strong financial resources. So on the other end of the spectrum, what we're now trying to do is to challenge that and really build a mass movement that is going to delve and meditate on how it is that we bring about change in the system. And that is then anchored on people power. So part of what we are currently immersed in is how do we sensitize people, make this palatable, but also, staying true to the fact that we're dealing with a very wicked problem. So part of that is about, sensitizing the masses. And this is what we're getting at, right? So hunger is a crime against our people. And in an upper middle income country like ours, South Africa should not be having the indicators it has in terms of the food insecurity context. So who are the criminals? And that's what we are trying to necessarily, drive through to the majority of our people. And then obviously part of that is to ensure that there's also an economic cost, right? We need to approach this in a very unorthodox way in light of our own restraints, of our own shortcomings, but also acknowledging that we cannot be given to easy analysis. So part of this is to try and provoke corporate actors themselves, to come to the table so that we have some kind of a meeting of minds. And part of that is to take them on from a PR perspective, to really articulate this issue in a way that then challenges their own credibility and I guess marketing posture to a whole range of these issues. So that's part of our approach at this stage. And then ultimately, how we are now then articulating this is about inequity, right? Because for a country like ours in South Africa, and I've heard people allude, right, to this fact that, multi-stakeholderism in particular offers an avenue, right, for this meeting of minds, for this coming to the table that I'm alluding to. But ultimately as well, we need to be clear, right, from a force field analysis, who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And my issue with multi-stakeholderism is that ultimately what we then experience once we find ourselves within those platforms is that liability and accountability somewhat become elusive when we are all somewhat responsible for the problem. And what we are seeing in South Africa is that this is why the index needs to explicitly explicitly assess and engage with pricing strategies and a whole range of all these other issues that Phil was touching on earlier, because we need to be clear, right, in terms of where accountability lies and where, you know, the bottlenecks are when we're speaking about trying to advance this discourse elsewhere. So let's talk about labor, let's talk about living wages, let's talk about a whole range of issues. Particularly in South Africa, we've had the Competition Commission as well assisting us, right, in terms of scrutinizing some of these super predatory capitalist behaviors within the food system. And I can tell you that, you know, we need to take them on. There's a lot of criminality happening in so far as the fulfillment of the right to food and nutrition is concerned in this country. Yes, I'm dashing through this. So obviously, what are we trying to do as activists, as those of the ground? We are building this people power. Do take time to check out our website, unionagainsthunger.org. What we're doing here, that's where we've pretty much tried to use to design this website as a resource point for all. But more importantly, this is where we try to articulate our frustrations, particularly around entities like ShopRite, who is the biggest stakeholder in South Africa's food value chain and so forth. So, do engage with that. So just to show you as well, in terms of our engagement, it's not necessarily adversarial, right? Because we do believe that corporates will be part of the solution. But however, this mistrust that I was talking about, this frustration we have with something that is firmly in the private sphere, talking as well about the policy inertia, the lack of leadership from the state. So what we are trying to do is to really bridge that gap, right? And ensure that corporates, find their way insofar as understanding that, look, at the end of the day, what we are talking about is a nourishing food system for all. Because what we have in South Africa at the moment is that there are those of us who experience the food system as would, some of us in a first world country. And then there are those of us within the same context who experience the food system as somebody would in a war zone country. So that's what we're trying to get at ultimately. As a union against hunger. And just to show you that, as a fledgling movement that came on board early in 2025, we are the new kids on the block. We are beginning to resonate with the political champions, and particularly following our World Food Day activities last year in October. It would appear that our petition and our memorandum that we submitted to the presidency is beginning to resonate with the powers that be, such that in commemoration of World Food Day last year, the president somewhat echoed some of our sentiments that we were then, sent through to his office in terms of the memorandum we had ushered through. Sorry, folks, that it was a bit rushed, but I hope I gave a snapshot of what we're trying to achieve out here in Africa, in South Africa, and how it is that we feel like, the efforts of institutions like the ATNI can better resonate and speak to our concerns and our posture to a whole range of these wicked and very complicated problems. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Professor, and amazing to hear. I think it's a really important place to end from the perspectives from South Africa there, the realities of coexisting forms of malnutrition in South Africa, and it grounds the whole discussion. I'm so sorry we've gone over time. I'm incredibly sorry for not having time for Q&As. I noticed some of the questions have already been responded to, but I hope this is just the start of a discussion. Thank you to all of our speakers today for making such generous contributions with your time and expertise. I wanted to say, and skipping through my first presentation, trying to go through as fast, I forgot to include my last slide of our conflicts of interest statement from UNUIIGH, which I am now posting in the chat. But thank you, everybody, for joining. We really appreciate it. And if you'd like to continue engaging on this discussion, please follow us, follow UNUIIGH via our social media, or sign up to our newsletter, and you can find the publications associated with this discussion. They've been posted in the chat. Thank you all very much, and we really hope to continue this discussion on corporate accountability in food systems, which is obviously an incredibly complex but important one. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. Thank you, everyone, and thank you again. Special thank you to our panelists.